Добрий день.
Good morning, my name is Olha and it's my pleasure to see everybody who joins us in Ukraine Media Center current forum. Today is day 607 of the full-scale invasion of our home led by Russian aggressor, and today we have invited you to discuss an important topic. We will be talking about an admission campaign 2023 in temporarily occupied territories, specifically in Crimea and Sevastopol city. We will be talking about it with regard to how to maintain the connections, the ties with the youth in the temporarily occupied territories. Joining us in this studio is Valentina Potapova, head of the Direction of National Advocacy Department of the Almenda Center for Civic Education. Also joining us online is Anastasia Kalinina, a lawyer at CrimeaSOS NGO. Also, we are waiting for Olha, Kuryshko, Deputy Permanent Representative of the President of Ukraine in Autonomous Republic of Crimea, to join us shortly. Well, Ms. Valentina, now the system is in place in Ukraine to allow the facilitated admission for the students from the temporarily occupied territory. So in your opinion, how does it help to maintain the ties with that youth who was forced to stay there? Thank you. Good morning. I really appreciate your question, and I would like to say that today's admission campaign 2023 is a jubilee campaign since the beginning of occupation. It's 10th campaign happening since the beginning of occupation, and Ukraine had 10 years to build the system for admission of Ukrainian children who were left in occupation. Why was it interesting for us to study this topic this year, specifically through the indicators of integration? Not only to study, not only to investigate the numbers, but also what we were interested in was dynamics, what happened in 10 years that the state of Ukraine had. Why was it important? Because it's been 2 years that parts of Zaporizhia and Kherson regions are occupied too, and we've thought that if the government was taking care of the matters of occupied territories within 10 years, they were taking care of the ensuring the rights of the children to exercise their right to education. So probably now we have achieved certain indicators, and this is why we've attempted to check out what exactly is happening in the education field and what indicators in education we can be talking about. So the first column you see is the column for years 13-14, and as you remember, back in 2014 children were graduating schools in Crimea and Sevastopol city in occupation already. Then there are numbers of graduates since year 2013 until year 23. So in orange is the indicator of the children who graduated in Autonomous Republic of Crimea, and in black is the number of children who graduated in Sevastopol city. So here are the numbers. As you may see, within 10 years, almost every year, there was about 10,000 graduates, more or less. Maybe 11, but the average is about 10,000. So we multiply 10 by 10, we get 100,000 graduates within 10 years. So how many of them were integrated into Ukrainian education system? So yet another indicator is the number of children who study this year in temporarily occupied territory of Crimea is 283,500 children. So what is the number of those who have access to Ukrainian language, out of those almost 300,000, because you understand, without knowledge of Ukrainian language, it's virtually impossible to enter a Ukrainian higher educational institution. So out of those 300,000 and 10,000 graduates, 197 children know Ukrainian language, 182 study in a so-called Ukrainian school near Feodosia. Why so-called? Because this school does not really have textbooks in Ukrainian language. So basically they study chemistry and physics in Ukrainian language using Russian textbooks. So you can imagine the way it happens and you understand how interesting it is. So 15 children per one class where curriculum is in Ukrainian language. This year there was 11,376 graduates. And here are the indicators. The number of graduates for 10 years that I've calculated. Out of them, within 10 years, only 3,992 were able to get a remote education or education on a remote basis, according to the Ministry of Education data. So it's only 3% of the children who ended up in occupation. And within 9 years, there's an indicator of 2015, because year 2015 had the highest indicator, the biggest figure, when the children were entering Ukrainian higher educational institutions. 943 children entered Ukrainian higher educational institution that year. Then the number will be decreasing. You see there is no peak in 2015. It starts from 2016. So 153 children. So why such a fall? 943 in 2015 and then 153 after the creation of the facilitated entrance system. So you've seen what was happening to the remote-based training, what going on with the subjects of Ukrainian language, Ukrainian history. So children had no access to Ukrainian education for 2 years, and those children who were graduating from 9th grade in 2016, they had to, they ran out of those certificates, so they had to get the certificate for the 9th grade, which was virtually impossible, and only then they had to enter the Ukrainian higher educational institutions. And back then the civil organizations started bombarding the Ministry of Education to make sure, to do at least something so the children, or so we could maintain this connection with the children in the occupied territories. And this is when the Order 271 appears, where they pass exams for grade 9 and grade 11 at the same time. And we start seeing certain growth. 204. We try to provide the information to the children in occupied territories that there is a facilitated system. You can have access. It's a lot of civil organizations that I will mention in the end, because it's not only our NGO. So 265, 274, and year 20, no matter that there was a COVID, we have a sustainable growth. Why? Because for the first time in 10 years, or basically in 7 years, children were provided with a real efficient remote education system. What the civil organizations were saying back in the years 2015, 2016, that we need a real efficient system of remote education. And regardless COVID, regardless anything, we see a sharp growth. 397 children from Crimea entered higher educational institutions. We called it back then, well, in the year 21, we called it the failure campaign, because the curve of the numbers is falling down. Well, then in year 22, I'm not going to explain you why the number was even smaller, because the full-scale invasion has begun. But even regardless of the full-scale invasion, children were still continuing to enter Ukrainian higher educational institutions. We were seeing problems in this area, and in coordination with other civil organizations, we tried to seek the attention of Ministry of Education to do something to avoid this fall that can happen. It was not the fall, it's not just a fall, it's the destruction of all ties with the children in temporarily occupied territories. But this year the number is not comforting at all. 86 children, and that's it. Everything we were able to do for the children in the temporarily occupied territories. Within this period, we had more than 150 applications submitted to us, and if you check out these infographics, you may see that the most of applications were about awareness. Children are just not able to get the information about what's going on in Ukraine because the Ukrainian websites are blocked. Everything related to Ukraine is blocked. And it happens so that, well, I can give you a couple of examples, but, well, let's postpone it a little bit. And then talking about applications is the opportunity for enter Ukrainian higher educational institution or transition to free education from contract-based. Then Ukrainian standardized graduation certificates, the school graduation certificates. And what I was surprised is when I was talking to the parents who were calling me, I've heard them say that they want to get Ukrainian higher education for their children, but it's very difficult. And they were all mentioning that Ukrainian language was lost completely. 197 children only have access to education in Ukrainian language in Crimea. So if nobody speaks Ukrainian in a family, if this language is not maintained in the family, unfortunately children lose it. And you know, entering a Ukrainian higher educational institution is something that really requires a knowledge of Ukrainian language. I can advise a couple of websites like All Ukrainian School Online, but you know, in my opinion, it's quite difficult to master the language only on your own. So this year we were helped by an activist, by a Crimean activist, who was spreading the information about the education opportunities. He was moving between different cities and settlements in Crimea. He was meeting the parents, he was meeting the kids who expressed a desire to enter Ukrainian higher educational institutions. And you see his quotations here on the website of Almenda. You can see a full interview, and it's very sad indeed. So he says that the demand for entering Ukrainian higher educational institutions and to maintain ties with Ukraine is very high, but the information is not enough. And I can say that information about the admission campaign this year was posted in the website of Ministry of Education in the end of July only, when the admission campaign was long in progress. Then it's about blocking. Then even using VPN, they cannot enter some websites. And then I can tell you that when we were talking to them, parents keep asking. They say like, oh, all right, we enter, we go to Kiev or Kharkiv or another Ukrainian city, Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk. But you understand that the children, they are minors, they have no passports. How come it's going to be a one-way ticket for them? Are there any social programs, financial support, anything else to, like, you know, a child is 17 years and they leave for Ukraine and they cannot come back to Crimea even until Crimea is not liberated. So it's a factor that should be taken into account when we build a government education policy. So here we identified the number of problems, the problems of communication with the educational centers, problems of awareness, and this activist, he says that that year nothing like that happened because he helps Crimeans for an umpteenth year, and he mentioned that nothing like that happened before, and he said that education centers even never responded. They were waiting for their or they were postponing their responses until the admission campaign ends. Like, you know, the admission campaign was in progress until the 23rd of September, and they were getting the responses from the education centers on the 25th of September. So the problem of language reintegration, the problem of transition to free education. For example, many applicants are afraid to enter because they're afraid they're not going to make it with their level of Ukrainian language. The problem of financial support and problem of additional space during the additional session. Additional session is until September 30, and all the higher educational institutions draw their quotes in August. So when the applicants come in September, they're being refused because all the quotes are drawn in August, so earlier, because the higher educational institutions have used them already. But I'm not going to blame the higher educational institutions for that, because if there are no applicants and they don't use the licensed spaces, they will be provided less licensed space for the next year. And then the challenges, I think I will have to give the floor to Anastasia Kalinina, because the first challenge is the most powerful, to maintain, to ensure the ties and their reintegration, to ensure their reintegration. So it's the absence of Ukrainian passport. If children could go to administration centers earlier to get Ukrainian passports, now they have no such opportunity. Then absence of personal taxpayer number. What is the problem there? So when the children enter, I mean those 86 kids, they entered the higher educational institution and they are being paid stipend, but to be paid stipend they need passport and they need individual taxpayer number. If they don't get stipend, there is a corruption risk for a higher educational institution, and to mitigate it, the higher educational institutions will have to remove those students. Also, they should be registered with the conscription offices, and if they are not registered, they are or they will be removed again. If they, or otherwise, if they do register, they put their families in Crimea under risk. And also there is a requirement from the Ministry of Education to start the offline education in 3 months. How do those children, or how are those children supposed to leave Crimea during the intense counteroffensive? We don't know it. And all of the government officials continue emphasizing that the Crimeans should not leave Crimea because it's dangerous. So 86 children who entered this year, they can basically removed until the 1st of January, and there is a high probability of that, and in our opinion we have to do something in order not to make it happen. And in coordination with other civil organizations, CrimeaSOS representative is going to join us. Their organization is dealing with those matters too. So we propose to develop a special education concept for the residents of such temporarily occupied territories, which will ensure the possibilities for the residents of those areas. We cannot adapt the same standards to different conditions, specifically in temporarily occupied territories. And I'm not only talking about Crimea now, it's also about the so-called newly occupied territories, which were occupied about 2 years ago. Ms. Anastasia, I'm hoping you're with us based on what Ms. Valentina has said. The most serious challenges are of legal nature. So what is the way out of this situation, in your opinion? Good morning. I appreciate the invitation and thank you for giving the floor to me. I agree completely with Ms. Valentina, and I have to state that every year, specifically after the year 21, the number of applicants from Crimea is decreasing more and more due to objective reasons, maybe some underperformance of the government or maybe poor communication. It was all mentioned by Ms. Valentina, and this is what we see in our work too. I would like to stop at the number of challenges Ms. Valentina has mentioned. First thing an applicant is facing: children decide to enter not on the very same date as they start entering or submit their applications. Well, we were trying to provide information to them in coordination with other NGOs. We were performing the monitoring of readiness of the higher educational institutions for the applicants, for admission of applicants from temporarily occupied territories. So we rely on the work of the government agencies on regulations, and it's difficult to do so when even the relevant government authority does not provide a clear information for the applicants from occupied territories. And obviously it cannot be like that in the end of July a person receives information about the admission campaign, they make a decision right away, and right away they come and enter. Well, it was difficult even before the full-scale invasion, and now it's even more difficult. Now there are two ways to leave Crimea, as we all know. One is through the bridge to Russian Federation, and then through the territories of Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Donetsk region that are all occupied. By both of those routes are extremely dangerous. Even when we advise them, we say that these ways they exist, but the people should decide on themselves because they are in charge of their security and safety, because both Crimean Bridge is a dangerous structure. In the same way, the route through the temporarily occupied territories of Zaporizhia, Kherson region, all that way goes through Mariupol, so it's a perilous path, specifically when we talk about children. also, even if they come up with such a decision, and if an applicant, that child, leaves Crimea, it's important to understand that the first thing they're facing, like the first problem they're facing, is that don't have Ukrainian documents. They are only supposed to leave you using the documents issued by occupational administrations. And according to the Russian legislation, the children below 18 years cannot move on their own. So they need to have one of their parents with them. It was expensive back then. It's even more expensive now because you have to go through all of Russian Federation, maybe through the territory of Russian Federation. There is a way, there is a checkpost Pokotilivka-Pokrovka between Belgorod and Sumy regions. It's a walking path, and I don't know how convenient is it for them. Maybe it's more convenient for them to enter through European countries. Well, that way has its challenges, because the children, they usually go through without documents, and as we've mentioned there, to understand that it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of meticulous and thorough planning. It's not done like on the very same day that they take the decision to enter. It does take time, and when the children end up there with their parents, when they end up in one country and then they get to the territory under Ukrainian control, they start facing the problem of issuing Ukrainian documents. As Ms. Valentina mentioned, one of the biggest problems now is that a child can be sent down if they don't provide documents and they don't physically show up after 3 months after the beginning of curriculum process, and until the end of the year it's quite clear who stays and who does not, and we all are very motivated, and it's in our best interest to make sure that the most children enter, because if they don't enter Ukrainian higher educational institutions, they enter Russian ones, and thus they cut all the ties with Ukraine. And if we talk about boys, they may be forcibly mobilized further on, because the children, well, the boys can be mobilized, and it's not quite clear what is the procedure, how they can be mobilized, or how can they avoid it. So it's in our best interest to make sure the most of the children enter Ukrainian institutes and universities, but for what we see, there is no proper mechanism in place. So when the child comes to have the passport of citizen of Ukraine issued, they have to end up in a territory under Ukrainian control, regardless of the fact that currently there is a lot of talks, or there are even some regulations in development which would allow having the Ukrainian passport issued abroad. It's an important solution. It's, I call it, not to lose our citizens. We have to keep track of our citizens, but still regulation is only in progress. So we've already lost this admission campaign, and as Ms. Valentina has mentioned, we understand that less license space can be provided for the next year, and it's one of the factors for both children and their parents for study in Ukrainian universities, because we understand that budget spaces is something that stimulates them to enter Ukrainian institutes and universities. And I would like to stop on that matter of Ukrainian documents. The documents is one of the most frequently asked questions in our legal consulting hotline. So it's not like everybody who applies for issue of Ukrainian passport, it's not like everybody wants to enter European higher education institutions. We were told frequently that those children want to enter European universities after they get Ukrainian passports. We explain everything to them, but we cannot present them. And we understand that it's the first time when those children are being issued Ukrainian documents, and it's a long procedure. First of all, children are being identified. They've been identified as Ukrainian citizens, and such identification can go on for up to 2 months, and they need to live somewhere during this period, specifically when they come with their parents. It takes time, and if we return to that same thing, when children have to provide the effective documents, effective passport and individual taxpayer number 3 months after they enter. So here are 2 of those 3 months already spent. And very frequently, sometimes we spend a couple of weeks just to submit the documents to have the passports issued, because it's been 10 years of occupation now, and we keep facing the cases of misunderstanding or non-understanding of people from occupied territories. But I have to sadly state that sometimes we see a desire in the workers of those offices in or desire to help, the desire to come up with some solution for such children. And when there are no data on those children in the registers, they don't have any documents they can submit to be identified as Ukrainian citizens. So frequently they use a mechanism such as word-of-mouth evidence. They can talk to the relatives or neighbors, and if there is no way to bring the relatives to the office of that authority where they apply for issuance of Ukrainian passport, it happens using the video conference, and there is information about that on the websites, but sometimes the employees don't really agree to that. And it creates additional obstacles in issuance of passports of Ukrainian standards. So all that way that I've told you about, they are all the legal problems that the children start facing, and we understand that it may take even more than 3 months even after the moment when a child discovers such opportunities for themselves, as Ms. Valentina has said, and as she covered in her presentation, the access to information is very difficult, specifically from Crimea. When we were monitoring this access, we've identified that all the numbers, all the information is only for the territories under Ukrainian government control. Maybe it's a little bit easier for those territories that were occupied in 2022 because there is access to Ukrainian websites there, and last year they could call there, and but for Crimea this information is virtually non-existent. If NGOs or activists or like indifferent people don't spread information like that, this information is closed, and we come to a point when we approach occupation and reintegration, or deoccupation and reintegration of Crimea, and we may find out that all of the youth leaves that place because Ukraine does not create conditions for the children to study normally, even so that they want to study. And to summarize what I've said, we have to remember that the European Union continues their protection programs, but it says that it creates more opportunities for Ukrainian children to enter European universities, and sometimes it's even easier for the children from occupied Crimea. So basically here we compete with everybody, both with Russian Federation and European countries, but they are our citizens, and competition is Anastasia, is it safe to say that in fact Russians issue their passports to anybody, anywhere, without any problems, imposing and promoting it, and we in our turn create a lot of obstacles for our citizens, due to which they cannot even obtain that passport? I imagine even if children go through the territories controlled by Russia to European Union and then they cross the border to our country without documents, it's difficult to imagine how it happens even. Do all of the children enter? Are all of them allowed? Because we understand that most likely they will have documents confirming their Russian citizenship. What should we do about that? Well, justly saying, it's sufficient to enter Ukrainian territory. What's difficult is all that way from Crimea through Russia and then coming to Ukraine to have the Ukrainian documents issued, because currently in the website of the State Bodyguard Service it says that they allow people in with the Ukrainian birth certificates, and thanks to the coordination with the State Bodyguard Service and the Ministry of Integration, we were accompanying many of such kids so they could enter easily. And there was virtually no problems as they were entering. So it's not so difficult to cross the Ukrainian border. It's more difficult to achieve it through all those territories, through Russia, through Europe, but even more time is necessary to get Ukrainian documents. So here we're talking about the terms. If all of that information is available, if they plan it back in spring, now we understand this, so the children could plan it, but the information is posted on the website in July. The admission campaign is in progress until September, so it's a very little time. It's not a complex approach to the admission campaign. What I want to add is, in the end of what Valentina was saying, it's very important now to develop a complex document for reintegration in educational field for the residents of temporarily occupied territories, not only Crimea, because this year it's 86 and next year I think this number will even be smaller. But to make it not smaller or at least equal or even bigger, we have to start preparing for it now, today, because I remember in year 2020, in year 22, Miss Valentina might add something, there were the accompanying persons in those higher educational institutions, so the parents, when they were sending their kids, they knew that there was somebody to take care of them, because from those universities we were monitoring, it's very little number of those who provide any place to live for those people, for those children to adapt to get Ukrainian documents issued. It takes a lot of time again. So there's very little information from the higher educational institutions. They do it just for the sake of doing, but we do it for the result, so that we don't face the fact when Russia succeeds in retaining our youth, retaining them as their reserve, because they should be our reserve. Thank you very much, Ms. Valentina. In the beginning of your presentation, you said that there was a sharp decline of those who wanted to enter, and it happened because the children did not get the certificates for the 9th grade. Can we say that now, conditionally speaking, in the newly occupied territories, this term of 2 years is expiring? Is it safe to say that we may expect such decline from other territories? Well, yes, it's about to happen. So, if we check the statistics of the Ministry of Education this year, there is, well, we were asking in our application what was the number of children entered from temporarily occupied territories of Crimea and Sevastopol, and what was the number of children entering from other temporarily occupied territories. So in Crimea it was a sharp decline, but in other occupied territories there was a very sharp climb. And how it happened? Children in the newly occupied territories, they try to leave those places. They have documents, they have Ukrainian passports, they have educational certificates for the grade 9. They were able within the year 22 to continue studying on a remote basis. In the year 23, in newly occupied territories, there is a very serious pressure exercised on the children and parents, so they don't study in Ukraine on a remote basis, but they continue doing that. But in 2 years, if we don't liberate our territories, we should expect for the decline that I've mentioned. So it's extremely important currently to adopt an educational concept that would take into account all of those things that were not done within 10 years for the temporarily occupied Crimea and Sevastopol and the so-called DPR and LPR, because it seems to me that now the time has come for the state to take care of those who remain in occupation. I'm seeing Olha Kuryshko here, and I want to say that there are certain movements going on, and I think that now, it may be a little bit sad. I mean, my presentation that I've just demonstrated, it would be the last sad presentation I show, because it seems to me that now there is understanding of what we were saying within 10 years. Unfortunately, Mr. Roman Hryshchuk is on his way. He was not able to join us, but there are certain steps that are taken by the Parliamentary Committee on Education as to the protection of children's right to education. I mean, those kids who end up in occupation. And there are certain steps who are made by the representative office. But what can we say about the representative office? They were always taking care of Crimeans. Miss Olga, you may add something. Please join us. We would like to hear. We see that the situation is, diplomatically saying, is not so bright, is a little bit pessimistic, but what maybe you can say something how to overcome this sharp decline. Thank you very much for invitation. I wanted to share some information about what we're doing in the representative office. We were working on the decree of the President of Ukraine on the re-establishment of the public authorities in the temporarily occupied Republic of Crimea, and it included a number of components. One of those components was a humanitarian aspect that includes cultural matters, education, and so on. And this is when we started working on our proposals to resume the operation of the educational institutions and resumption of education in temporarily occupied territories. There was communication on different levels, including through the committee that Ms. Valentina has mentioned. It takes care of a lot of matters. There is a lot of challenges in the world due to the full-scale invasion, destruction of infrastructure, but they have also started to talk about the facts that we need a roadmap, a general concept for resumption of education in the temporarily occupied territories, but the problem is that this roadmap should include not only renewal and reconstruction of infrastructural facilities like construction of new schools, but also delivery of children from one educational institution to another. When we talk about villages, for example, it also includes the printing of textbooks So the civil organizations and us on our end, we try to provide the information on militarization that is in progress in Crimea, about those new things that are being added by the occupier on an annual basis. For example, they act in such a way that you cannot avoid participation in the militaristic events. You cannot avoid participating those patriotic education events. So it continues influencing the children. Almenda had a very good presentation. I was impressed by it. It's about memorialization, what the Russian Federation is doing in temporarily occupied territories when they glorify the heroes of special military operation. However, they are the victims of this war. So getting back to the education concept, we were seeing that it has to be beyond those challenges that existed within these years, because the full-scale invasion has demonstrated that the occupier, well, they act in the same way always. What was going on in Crimea is happening now in newly occupied territories, like forcible passportization, burned textbooks. When children cannot go to school, they cannot continue their education if they don't get the Russian Federation passport. If you refuse, you have problems further on, because you don't have social security, you don't have any social guarantees that can help you survive in temporarily occupied territories. This is why we included this in the general concept of the resumption of the state operations in the temporarily occupied territories. It says that we need to develop a roadmap. We were communicating with the community and Ministry of Education. We said that this roadmap should contemplate specific education programs for the children that were staying in occupied territories for a prolonged period. I was talking about militarization. Miss Valentina was saying about the absence of opportunities to study in Ukrainian language. So they don't study Ukrainian history there, but it's a more of a profound problem, because the people who live in the temporarily occupied territories, including well, they don't even know about the reforms. They don't know how the life has changed in the territories under Ukrainian control within these 9 years. So it shouldn't be an education program that is being taught in the occupied territories now. It should be an adaptive programs to understand the conditions the children were living in within these 9 years. It's one thing. Yet another thing that was not touched upon here is the training of those who will be teaching. Now the Ministry of Education on the 17th of October, Cabinet of Ministers adopted the new procedure for the education sphere employees reserve. I expect for the results of this procedure implementation. So it's for those educational employees who go to work in the temporarily occupied territories after the occupation. It's a huge challenge to overcome, to mitigate all those consequences of the actions of the aggressor state. Another thing is cognitive deoccupation. We talk about it in our official sources. We started the work on the steps for cognitive deoccupation. We have a working group in place in the ministry, about 40 representatives of the government authorities, including this and also including civil organizations and other actors. So cognitive deoccupation is more about education, because it's called to return the people to the educational space in the territory under Ukrainian control. So there's a number of steps to be taken to overcome that abyss that was created during these 9 years. So all of the participants continue submitting their application, like countering propaganda, debunking of myth that Russian Federation continues spreading in temporarily occupied territories. They have a very powerful propaganda machine working there. So it's about memory, memorialization, So there's a lot of components. And yet another problem, why from the very beginning I was saying that we started going beyond thinking out of the box. So it's understanding of what we are supposed to do after the occupation with those who unfortunately were not able to live and study here. And we should mention the draft law 9591. I appreciate the support of the civil organizations which supported us and Ministry of Education, the Education Committee in this area. So this draft law is about evaluation of results of training that was undergone in temporarily occupied territories, because for example in the year 2022 in the temporarily occupied Crimea 90,000 people were acquiring education. Talking about the numbers that were mentioned by my colleagues, the difference is tremendous, and after the occupation those people will stay there, they will have some results of some training. Either now or later they will be able to get this education. Someone was unable to leave because it takes a lot of time, a lot of documents, you have to make it within a short period, and many people were afraid to leave just due to the shellings, it's quite clear. So they started getting education in temporarily occupied territories, but they wanted to continue studying in Ukrainian higher educational institutions. We had applications about that. So this draft law should allow us to evaluate the results of their training so they could study in territories under Ukrainian control. It was adopted during the first reading on the 23rd of August this year, and we expect for it to be adopted during the second reading. So that's in brief. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Should you have any questions? Well, now that there are no questions on the floor, I have a question, very important, I think. So everybody who tracks all those legal processes with regard to occupied territories, I'm really happy that there is a systemic work going on, or understanding of what we will do after the occupation. So talking about all those problems that Anastasia mentioned too, for example, the acquisition of passport by our children, are there any procedures that or anything in development that can help them to solve those problems? Well, I'm not even talking about the occupation that we're waiting so bad. Yeah, I was listening to Miss Anastasia very attentively, and I have to say this procedure, we call it remote identification, but in fact this question was asked in the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, because many citizens of Ukraine were living back then, and they started living the temporarily occupied territories back when there was a threat of mobilization. People wanted to leave. You remember there were borders closed, and the Russian Federation was closed borders, and many people were having problems with acquisition of passports, because back then government offices were not open. The mobile stations started opening only, and it was impossible to get a Ukrainian passport abroad. Now the work is underway. You know, in some representative offices abroad you can get Ukrainian passports. We were in communication, but thanks to the State Migration Service, we implemented the experimental project of remote identification. I was going through this procedure with one of the applicants. He was the first applicant in Ukraine, so basically they have to stay physically here, but the witnesses who confirm his or their identity, they may be staying in temporarily occupied territory. So it was the first case of implementation of this project, and yes, they received their passport eventually. Then during the meeting with the State Bodyguard Service, you know, their position is such that they are citizens of Ukraine and they have a right to come back to Ukraine without any obstacles. More problems emerged during the entrance from Crimea, because this way through Russian Federation and Belarus, as Ms. Anastasia has mentioned, and there are questions to Belarus side, is that they have joint lists with Russian Federation, and really there were problems when they were checking documents, they were interrogating people for a long period, specifically if they were men of conscription age, so they had many questions to them. It's clear that there should be a period for issuance of Ukrainian passport. I can say that it's a pilot project. I cannot say it didn't work. I cannot say it worked very smooth, but it's an option still. Thank you very much, dear friends. Well, I would like to add just a couple of words. We really have a lot of problems, and I do hope that the processes that are underway in the Parliamentary Committee and those processes that were launched by the Ministry of Education to create such an education concept. But I know how long it takes. This is why, if we may, let's try to protect at least those 86 children who already have entered Ukrainian higher educational institutions. And to protect them, first of all, we need to cancel this requirement of 3 months. We need to extend this period at least until the end of active battle operations, or like 1 year, as they finish the first year on a remote basis. Then the switch from offline to online mode, or the other way around, so it doesn't cover the children in temporarily occupied territories, so that they could continue online education, so that they could do it further on. We need some explanation letters from Ministry of Education, or some regulations which do not require certain involvement or some active involvement of the Parliament or other government institutions. And also we need explanation letters about the stipends, we need explanations about the conscription certificates, because there are 86 children from Crimea only. I don't know what is the number of children staying in temporarily occupied territories of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kharkiv, Kherson, Zaporizhia regions. But I know that there are children who, due to certain circumstances, cannot proceed to higher education. We need to do it now. What Olga says, what Anastasia said, those processes that are underway, I know that they started happening. It will be solved further on, but we will have those children saved. We're not going to push them away, push away the kids who trusted in Ukraine, who have become the students of Ukrainian universities. Thank you very much, Miss Valentina, Miss Olga, Miss Anastasia. Thank you for this frank conversation. I think that these changes will eventually take place at the regulatory level, legislative level, and we will stimulate our Ukrainian kids to enter our Ukrainian higher educational institutions. So once again, thank you. We want to thank the Security and Defense Forces for all they do for us. We continue working for our victory, and glory to Ukraine. Thank you.
Дякую вам. Приходьте.